Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Photographing Big Things, presented by Dr. Court Whalen. Court has been guiding worldwide for NatHab since 2013 and is our Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel. Thanks for being with us today, Court. I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks, Kendall. How are you, folks? Good to be on here today. Greetings from a very sunny, summery day in Boulder, Colorado. Yeah, thrilled to be doing this presentation. The big things. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Well, why am I doing a talk on the big things? Well, I thought it'd be kind of a nice little play off of the last couple weeks webinars where I've been talking about the little things, the macro photography. And I thought, well, gosh, we can't just focus on the little things. We got to focus on the big things too. But the other few reasons is that one, the big things, it's the stuff you don't really need to convince people on. When I talk about macro photography, I usually have to sell people on, like, oh yeah, you should totally enjoy, photographing this little bug or this little dragonfly or this flower. The big stuff, the tigers, the bears, the lions, the elephants, the whatever. This is the stuff we all want to photograph. In fact, that's a lot of what we do as a safari outfitters. We're taking to show people the big charismatic megafauna of the world. The other reason is, I think, and this is a topic I'm really looking forward to getting into next week, is conservation photography. I think the value of photographing some of the world's biggest things is one of the most important things we can do as conservation photographers, and really as conservationists, storytellers, people just like me and you, to help showcase the great animals of the world, because what they are is that they're flagship species. They're species that kind of resemble, or they represent an ecosystem. And when you can showcase these guys, when you can save them, you can save all the great stuff underneath of it. But really, the idea today is to talk about the big stuff, because I think it's very easy to say, oh yeah, get me in front of a tiger, I want to photograph it. And you snap, and boom, done. It's a tiger, or it's a brown bear, or it's lions in the savannah. And it's amazing. You don't have to do much to make these photos look good, these animals look good. But I think you miss out on a very, very important thing if you don't think next level, is because you're getting put in front of the opportunity of a lifetime, the sighting of a lifetime in many cases. I can't tell you how many trips I've been on with guests where I've seen the very best sighting of that species or that thing in my entire professional career. So you're getting these opportunities. So let's make sure that we're being highly conscientious in photographing them to the best of our abilities, because there are certain considerations to make. So there's a balance of the challenge and the opportunity here. So there actually are some challenges, finding them, of course. Now you leave that to us or your safari guide, but showcasing them to their max potential is really one of the things that we look at as a challenge. But the opportunity is that you can take some of the most amazing storytelling photos, and really some of the most amazing photos out there in the world, when you do get great shots of the great megafauna on our planet. And without further ado, I should also mention landscapes as well. So, the meat and potatoes of this talk is really going to be on wildlife, but I definitely want to make parallels to some of the big landscapes out there too. You'll probably be pleasantly surprised if you were to just ignore all the references I make to a certain animal or certain wildlife and just take the same principles and move it to landscapes. They all completely apply, but I will provide some tangible examples as we go through here. Because big landscapes, again, big opportunity. They have their own challenges, but big opportunity. Okay, so I'm going to be very, very brief on this section, because it's probably the most subjective part of the entire topic of photographing big stuff. It's not like my other primate photography talks or macro photography talks where there's very specialized gear. You can photograph big things with pretty much anything out there. But nevertheless, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it very briefly of what kind of gear you do need. So of course you need a camera. Here's where point and shoots and the DSLR and mirrorless category, they kind of have very strong, pros and cons either side. Both have their pros, absolutely. The big pro of the point and shoot and those cameras where you don't need to change lenses is that you have maximum versatility. And maximum versatility is really, really key. You can be taking a landscape shot 1 second, or a big wide angle landscape shot with wildlife in it 1 second, and zoom in to fill the frame of your camera with its face the very next second. That's a huge positive to photographing big things. On the other side, the big fancy DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, they will provide the utmost quality. And I think that when we're talking about getting the best shots in the world of the most amazing animals of the world, that extra little 10%, 20% sometimes of quality, the sharpness, the megapixels, the depth of field, the dynamic range, all these things that we pay the big bucks for, that can really put that photograph to the next level. And I've been known to say this from time to time, but I don't know if it's the perfectionist that makes the photographer, or if photography turns us into perfectionists. But I know that throughout my career, I've gone through the spectrum, starting with point and shoots, all types, and then I've definitely worked my way up to the higher megapixel count, the more quality, the sharpness, et cetera, because I am in front of the world's most amazing animals. I'm in front of gorillas one month, and orangutans the next, and lemurs the next, and monarch butterflies the next, and I want to be able to capture them with the most definition. So I do go for more of the fancier stuff. The great news of all this is that if you do go for the fancy cameras, you don't need anything highly specialized. A very general wide angle lens for landscapes and a very multi-purpose zoom telephoto lens for wildlife is what I recommend. Now, we could go into all sorts of technicalities on, do you get these really big bazooka lenses like your 400mm primes, with f2.8, and just, they cost tens of thousands of dollars. Again, I do weigh that versatility, and I try to inject that versatility into my DSLR. And so I go with a 100 to 400mm lens. And yeah, I could give you all the reasons why a 70 to 200 might be good sometimes. A 200 to 500 might be good. The primes might be good. But again, I try to add maximum versatility here. Okay, so let's go into techniques and tips here. Right off the bat, make an impression. Make a big photo of the big stuff. I think, when you get in front of big animals, this is one of the biggest opportunities that you have, is you can make what I call a big photo. And my little trick here, and I've talked about this in other webinars, I think specifically in my Nature Photography 101, right off the bat, was that, a big photo to me is that if you scale a photo all the way down to a small little thumbnail size, like an internet size, a social media size, where people are just scrolling through pages and seeing your stuff, if they see your photo and it makes an impression and you can tell what that photo is and it stops them in their tracks, you flipping through a travel catalog, flipping through a National Geographic, and you have a small little photo, it makes a big impression. That's a big photo to me. So having the composition edge to edge, filling the frame with the animal is always a great thing. We're going to talk about this in a few slides from now, but don't always feel compelled to get the entire animal in the shot. With the big things, it's actually kind of harder to do, to get every single appendage of the polar bear, or to get all of the elephant's ears, or the tiny brushes on the tail of the elephant. Sometimes break your scene into smaller parts. We're going to have a dedicated slide on that here in a few, but this shows you that you can really fill the frame with that color and with that animal. Don't just look at the animal and say, well, okay, great, I'm going to document it. This is an amazing animal. Snap, it looks great in the back of your camera. Take it to the next level and really add the artistry into the photo. Think about traditional rules of composition, as you'll see here, and then lighting, as you'll see next. So look at this photo and look how perfectly it adheres to the rules of composition. Remember, there are a few different ways that we interpret what we call the rule of thirds, okay? So we envision, or in some digital cameras, we can actually put this tic-tac-toe board over our viewfinder. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to break it into significance using these thirds top to bottom, thirds left to right. How are we composing the photo? When possible, especially with wildlife, and you'll see this perfectly here, we want to add significance to those intersecting points, maybe just one of those 4 intersecting points. But notice how this polar bear lines up perfectly to that top third line. And right at the intersecting point in the top left, it's right where I'm tack sharp focused. It's right where you're looking right off the bat. There are some really fancy rules of mathematics having to do with this idea of a Fibonacci sequence that gets translated into the Fibonacci spiral in art. I'm not going to go into that here. I did go into it in 101 and 102, but just to tell you, always start with the rule of thirds and add that artistry into your shot. And think about lighting too. Don't just because we're seeing something big and cool doesn't mean you shouldn't stop trying to make lemonade out of it. Yes, you're handed something much better than lemons with a big polar bear or a lion, but try to make it the absolute best you can. So we always love side lighting. Notice how the sun is coming in at an angle. It's kind of creating a little bit of contrast, a little bit of shadowy. This is something that you can pick up from portrait and model photography, but it's the same thing. When photographing big wildlife, they are our models. Use those traditional rules of rule of third and try to get nice soft lighting coming in at an angle. Top-down lighting, not always the best. Perfect lighting from behind you, showcasing the animal, you're not going to get a lot of shadows and not going to get a lot of that unique contrast that gives personality. In addition, that side lighting of a nice light source to the side, sometimes you can get that eye sparkle, which I've talked about in previous webinars. which is really nice. We call it catch light. Kind of going through here, this is going to be sort of a quick tutorial of all these different things because we have a lot to cover. Provide context, give a sense of scale. I think a lot of people really hate when we're on safari and someone walks in front of your camera, a vehicle drives in front of your vehicle. You know, you have the perfect position, and this happens, you know, to us sometimes. But embrace it. I think by providing some context into your shots and getting that vehicle, getting that person with the wildlife, it actually makes for an equally unique shot. I think, you know, a lot of times when we're seeing big animals, we can't quite appreciate, you know, how big a hippopotamus is. I mean, if you have never seen a hippopotamus, could you stand up right now and tell exactly where on your body that back stands? Probably not. It might even be over your head, believe it or not. So providing context of vehicles we are familiar with, you know, cars, you know, other types of transportation, people, structures like houses or even roads. It really provides a lot of context and it levels up your photography in a big way when photographing, again, the big things, because size is really, really key. Making that transition to landscapes, providing familiar things like roads and paths really help provide context. Even though you might not want to photograph a road or a worn pathway in the midst of this beautiful savanna, you might find it's really, really nice when you go back and look at your photos at the end, and it kind of provides context, a little storytelling of where you're going, where you've been, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, you know, we're in front of the Grand Tetons near Jackson, Wyoming, and you think, well, gosh, the perfect photo is going to be without anybody, without any vehicles, nice blue sky, cool cloud going right through the Tetons. And yeah, that shot's great too. But remember, we're trying to get next level, and sometimes these contextual shots of having your safari vehicle, having your group in the shot really makes it, it's a longer story, it's a more robust story. There are more chapters to the story. So yes, the mountains look great on their own, but you can't really tell me that this van totally detracts from the shot. Now, yeah, if you're trying to sell this to a doctor's office to put in their waiting room, maybe that's not the perfect thing. If you're trying to get in the cover of National Geographic, but as far as your memories and what you like, you might have a better story by providing that context to your photographs. New angles to showcase size and magnitude. Again, we're talking about the big things. So you want to showcase big landscapes, big wildlife. Use angles to your advantage. When you are on foot on safaris around the world, doesn't have to be an African safari, it could be in Alaska, it could be in Borneo, they're all safaris. Here we are in Namibia. You know, when you're on foot, which you can safely do in Namibia, get down a little bit and choose a different angle. We're very used to seeing things from our own eyes and from, you know, about 4, 5, 6 feet above the ground. If you change that angle, you can create a unique perspective that might be even more beautiful than you can see with your eyes by standing on your feet. It also showcases the big skies. It showcases things in a really different way. So what a better way to encapsulate and incorporate the big landscape of Namibia other than to get down on my haunches, get a nice wide angle shot of the ground kind of leading up to the sky. It really yields a lot if you can be low and shoot high when trying to showcase and portray big wildlife. So here we have a proboscis monkey in Borneo. This is another great example. You probably can't quite tell this, but I am trying to showcase this as one of the world's biggest monkey species. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm just a little bit lower than it. Okay, so this actually lends itself very, very nicely to monkeys and primates because they often are found in trees. But when you do have a chance, this is actually at one of the sanctuaries and it was just sitting on one of the pathways, I could actually get a little bit lower and photograph up. And what it does is it makes the animal look bigger, more magnanimous, and that's what we're trying to showcase is the grandeur of these animals. One thing I absolutely love about boat safaris, whether you're in Africa or here, we're actually in Borneo on the Kinabatangan River, is that you are a little bit lower. I like that lower position because you can either shoot directly across the animals or again, kind of showcase them in that grandeur way by photographing at a slight upward angle. And we've done this here at these pygmy elephants. Now, these are the world's smallest elephants, but they look really, really big, even with this younger one in the foreground. And it kind of showcases the big vegetation, the big animal. So it's not necessarily all about showcasing big animals as big as they can get. That's kind of how I started off. Those are some techniques for doing so, but we can switch it up a little bit here. We can showcase and balance that big and small. And one of my personal holy grails to photographing wildlife is to photograph wildlife in landscapes. And what I mean by that is, make sure that the landscape you're photographing them in is as equally interesting or provides some sort of additional story to the photograph of the wildlife itself. So what that means oftentimes is you're taking a relatively big animal, a 1 to 200 pound ape, as in with this orangutan here in Borneo, and you're photographing an even bigger landscape, and all of a sudden it does look kind of small in the scene. But again, if you watched a lot of my previous presentations, you're knowing that storytelling is a huge part of photography. So showcasing the habitat, this is definitely not in a zoo. This is definitely not in someone's backyard. This is in the wilds of Borneo. And you can tell, because as tempting as that big full frame close-up shot is, there's something really, really unique about getting animals in the landscape. And this is a great way to do so. So what I do is I often will photograph, kind of set up for a landscape shot with the animal inside of it, and I'll exaggerate composition, okay? So I've often said that rules are meant to be broken, specifically when talking about the rule of thirds. So you heard about the rule of thirds here in a few slides back, but I didn't mention specifically at this webinar that, you can always break those rules, and this is exactly one of those times that I break it, is when I'm trying to exaggerate the composition. So notice that if we were to, kind of imagine that tic-tac-toe board over this photo, traditionally I like to put wildlife at one of those intersecting points. This is clearly outside of that intersecting point, but what it does is it showcases that you have a nice animal, it's in sharp focus, but it's in a big, big landscape, and I love that effect. Another time things can be meant to be broken, or the rule of thirds can be meant to be broken, is putting animals smack dab in the middle of the frame. I don't usually advocate for that, especially if the animal is a sizable portion of your frame. But here, what I'm trying to do is, we're in the Namib Desert here in central Namibia, and I'm breaking the rules here by putting this large elephant, probably stands 10, 11 feet tall, large African elephant, and I'm making it look small by photographing this huge landscape, and I'm putting it right smack dab in the middle. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't look good with it at one of those rule of thirds intersecting points. I think that's a great practice, great experience, great thing to try. But sometimes when you're trying to showcase something beyond the animal first, in this case, the landscape, the size, the expanse, putting that animal smack dab in the middle just to make the viewer easier to find that animal can work quite well. Now, I don't advocate for breaking the rules of third or the rule of thirds very often, but those were a couple key points. And again, one of my favorite things to do is get photographs of animals in great landscapes and showcase both in concert. Another great thing to do with big animal photos in even big landscapes is switch to black and white. And this is something I really haven't talked a whole lot about in my webinars to date, but I think it's a really, really great technique when you do have something that is magnanimous, that is big, that is so amazing. Because I do think, in my personal photography, I like colors, I like the pop, I like the saturation. And I think that, photographing black and white might take something away, from that beautiful blue and red tree frog or poison dart frog or that little flower. But when you have big animals, it makes something really, really impactful. So I love photographing big animals in black and white. And here's how I do it. So first of all, I don't actually photograph it in black and white. I take it with all the detail. I don't switch anything in my camera. This goes for all of you out there, whether you're with a point and shoot or a fancier DSLR, just take the shot as is, and you will switch to black and white in your post-processing. And what that usually comes down to is, if you do anything with your photos, you're probably familiar with the saturation slider. All you do is just take that saturation slider and slide it all the way down to 0 saturation, and you basically get a black and white photo. But again, taking black and white photos is a great differentiator as well. I don't think many people shoot in black and white these days because it does require big, bold subjects or big, bold landscapes to do so. But if you're out on safari anywhere in the world, it's a great tool to have. And really what you're trying to do with it is not necessarily take every photo on the computer and play around. You can photograph with black and white photography in mind. So the thing is, even though you're not switching anything in your camera, you can photograph with black and white photo in mind. What are you looking for? So first of all, there's kind of two halves of it. So it's looking for the object and taking the photo. First of all, I look for high contrasts. I look for lots of textures. I look for lots of things that can be very jagged, maybe sharp, kind of rough, and very impactful, very, very interesting in this case. And so what I'm doing here, it's good for midday photography, and I think that's a really, really great thing to keep in mind. Oftentimes we'll talk about lighting in photography, and we say midday is not a good time to photograph. In fact, usually when we're on photo safaris, we're prioritizing the start and end of the day, and midday is kind of left open. If you find yourself out at midday, one of the greatest ways to make lemonade out of lemons, make lemonade out of harsh lighting conditions, is embrace the harshness and switch to black and white, or think in black and white and prepare to switch on the computer when it's after the fact. So Ansel Adams was definitely onto something. I'm not sure if he had any other option, but nevertheless, big landscapes, big magnanimous scenes. And here we are, Mount Denali, over 20,000 feet in Alaska. We have a nice scene that presents a lot of contrast, meaning a lot of lights, a lot of darks. A big scene with some dominant subject there, Mount Denali, the high one as they call it, all the way on the right. And then a lot of nice kind of soft tones that gradually enter into the scene, some of these midtones. So again, a lot of contrast, a lot of texture, a lot of lights and darks, and a big thing to photograph. Really, really good for black and white. So again, another example here, we actually have two more examples. This is a photograph that I actually personally like more in color. I'm not going to show it to you because then you'd make up your own mind, but painted dogs of Africa, another great example. Their fur is very mottled in that they have a lot of lights and darks on it. The grass is a very light verdant green. So it makes her a really, really good subject to convert to black and white. And last but not least, animal portraiture. I think it can be really good when you have that nice soft angular lighting. If I thought maybe I would put, that cool light icon logo coming in from the right to show that the light is coming in at an angle. But notice how the left side of this female orangutan, right on your screen, but left side of her is nice and illuminated, that beautiful catch light, a lot of lights and darks, very enigmatic, very mysterious. I think black and white also does good for kind of creating that additional story, that intrigue. You're not providing all the information, you're not providing all the data, you're not providing all the color. So it offers that unique kind of what is behind this storytelling element of the photograph. So definitely give it a shot. You can make any photo black and white on the computer, but doing so as you're taking the photograph and looking for those scenes and exposing your camera properly, et cetera, is really nice to do when you're taking the shot itself. Okay, so photograph in parts, breaking the scene down. We have this really, really great luxury that nowadays we can very easily show sets of photos. We can show albums. We're not just all up to one photo. We can actually show, an entire scene broken down into a number of different parts. So the obvious choice here, of course, is to photograph, the head. If you're going to break a big animal like this Galapagos giant tortoise, you're going to break it down and photograph its head. You can do that with elephants and lions and any number of things. But think beyond that. This is my advice to you. Think beyond that and look at parts of the animal that are really interesting. Like look at the texture of this foot pad. I mean, that is wild that this thing is walking on such texture. It looks like the surface of some remote desert, right? So breaking your scene down into multiple parts. I'm not saying don't photograph the whole animal. I'm not saying don't photograph the head, but looking at what other things can you photograph. Elephants, great example. A lot of animals, if they're a big animal and you can get reasonably close with a telephoto zoom lens as well, you can actually photograph just parts of it, photographing only the eye, photographing only the ear, only the snout, only the mouth. It makes for really, really compelling photographs. And again, these are big photographs of big animals. This animal is actually not one of the bigger ones. This is actually a chameleon about the size of, yay big, football size. But nevertheless, it's a great example of photographing the skin of an animal. Sometimes when you do get a chance to get pretty close to a lion or a cheetah or a leopard, apes of Africa, apes of Southeast Asia and Borneo, you can get close enough where you can fill the frame with just the texture of its skin, its fur. Reptiles, another great example. Even though I wouldn't necessarily put them in the really big things category, you can see how cool it is. If you get the right ratio and fill the frame with just its skin, it can be a really spectacular photograph. Picking out specific elements is really great for landscapes as well. So here we have a beautiful mountain scene in Colorado up at Brainerd Lake. Great shot. I wouldn't say don't take this photo, but if you start to think differently and what parts of the scene are the most interesting, what offer the most textures, interesting patterns, this is where I actually advocate for folks to bring a telephoto zoom lens with them, even on, fully landscape focused outings. You can actually break the scene into its parts, photograph the mountain for one cool shot, photograph the trees for one cool shot, another shot completely bisecting, breaking that rule of thirds, completely bisecting with that perfect reflection of trees right on the lake shoreline, breaking your scene into parts for big scenes is really, really helpful. Depth of field. So this is where we get into some of the challenges. This is a little bit of a troubleshooting topic here. So depth of field is, it's a big deal for big photos. And the reason is that when you're photographing, we're gonna go back to this shot of the elephant here, is, we're looking at this elephant from a safari vehicle, 20, 30 feet away, something like that. And you get the bright idea that I'm gonna photograph its eye. Okay, great. So you put on the telephoto zoom lens if you don't already have it on, you zoom in, and very easily you can photograph just a small part of that animal. Now you think to yourself, I'm just gonna photograph on very normal settings, just put it on auto or put it on P, or just, shoot it at normal like f5.6. And I'm gonna get the shot. It's gonna all be in focus, and I'm gonna get all the textures and cool wrinkles and the eyelashes all at once. So here's where you gotta take into consideration is that your scene, even though it's a small snippet of the animal, the frame is still treated like any other frame. So if any part of this elephant is closer or further from you in relation to its size in the frame, things are gonna start to get out of focus quickly. So don't worry about all the explanation of that, but just remember this, is that you have to shoot at a bigger depth of field than normal. What that means is a bigger F number than normal if you want to get everything in focus. So here we're a little bit more zoomed away, but with this male orangutan in Borneo, part of the brilliance of course, is these massive cheek flanges that they use to reverberate their voice up to like a mile through the forest. But the other part is this amazing Chewbacca-like woolly outfit that this guy's wearing. This amazing coarse hair, the beautiful color in combination to the rest of the animal. And it'd probably be a good shot if just the face was in focus and the hair was blurred. But you have to remember that the animals big animals take up a much bigger part of your frame. So a shallow depth of field will actually blur parts of a single animal you may not wish blurred. So I typically go for things like f8 and above when I'm shooting big shots of big animals, especially when I'm filling a frame with those unique shots of like just the foot pad of a giant tortoise or just the eye of an elephant. We're looking at bigger F numbers like f8 and above, even f11 if you have the light for it, as a general rule of thumb. Another example here, we have the world's smallest bear species, the Bornean sun bear, but definitely not lacking in charisma. One of the most amazing bears to see and photograph. They are notoriously difficult to photograph because you can get so close to them and you're so tempted to fill the frame. Look, I'm on f8 or f11 right here, and I got the eyes in really, really nice sharp focus, but look, the snout is a little bit blurred, and definitely the rest of the body is blurred because of the relationship, the ratio of that animal in my frame. So when in doubt, remember, big wildlife that take up most of your frame, shoot at a higher F number at first, if you can afford to do so with lighting. And then, as you get that initial shot, then you can start thinking creatively and then intentionally blurring things, which I'm sure you might wish to do so. That's another part of great portrait photography too. Okay, animal behaviors. This is a huge part of wildlife photography, a huge part of photographing big things, and a huge part of conservation photography, which again, I'm gonna be talking about in depth next week at the same time, same place. So the way to do so is you want to capture this in burst mode. We're getting into a little more of the settings and the definite tips, less of the technique, but definitely the tips. What we're doing here is we're getting our camera on maximum frame rate. So what that means is that every camera out there has some way to take a normal shot of like one photo every second when you hold the shutter down, but with just a quick touch of one or two buttons in the menu system, you can maximize it where you're taking 3, 4, 5, 6. Some of the best cameras out there now are taking 20 photos per second. And what that does is for highly charismatic animals, when you might only get one shot of this species throughout an entire expedition, or you might get the very, very best view for only a few seconds, you get many more photos to work from, and it's hugely important. So what this thing is in the top right-hand corner, I don't know if I'm pointing in the right way depending on your screen, but nevertheless, I'll circle it here. This is the icon that you're looking for. And there are about, 500 different camera makes and models out there today. So I can't tell you exactly where it is in your menu system, but I can tell you they all come with a manual, and you can also search on the internet for where it's found in your system. The buzzwords we're talking about is frame rate or burst mode. Usually it's actually a button on the camera itself. You don't have to go in the menu system. And what you're looking for is the highest frames per second, or FPS. And so great example here, we have a sun bear again. I have been photographing these guys for years, and I can tell you the hardest thing to do is to capture that sun, that crescent sun their namesake on their chest. They just, for whatever reason, they don't display it. I think maybe because it's actually used as sort of a sign of aggression at times. And so when they're happy and healthy, they're not really, you know, standing up proud like that. But nevertheless, when they're playing around and turning their heads and getting up trees, I wanted to photograph that because it's actually a great identifying factor. And so at Natural Habitat, we've been sponsoring and paying for one of these lovely little sun bears at the Sun Bear Conservation Center for a couple of years now. And I wanted to make sure I identified Wawa. Her name's Wawa, W-A-W-A. And I still hadn't been able to get that crescent shape, but I finally got it. I talked to Dr. Wong, who's the proprietor there and the main conservation biologist. And finally, I've been able to photograph Wawa. So here she is, all due to getting on burst mode, shooting like 20 frames a second, so that, you know, in that brief moment that she's turning, I was able to stop her moving and get that beautiful crescent shape for the photo. So again, high frame rate, very, very important. Other examples here, I could probably show hundreds of examples for the rest of this presentation of those moments that, those photos that made the trip for me. You know, monkeys looking at their hands, like what an interesting juxtaposition and story this is of one of the, you know, the larger primates in Borneo, kind of looking at its hand pensively, kind of human-like with those fingernails. You know, this was just a quick moment. I'm going to reenact it as if I'm the monkey. You know, he just picks his hand up briefly and then puts it down. You know, this is not him studying it for hours. This is one single moment I was able to capture because of burst mode. So I highly recommend you figure that out. You don't necessarily need it on your camera for all shooting, for all photographs of landscapes or photographs of wildlife, but when you are photographing big stuff, it's hugely important because, again, some of these scenes where you have a clear path through the trees to a proboscis monkey, or you're watching a sun bear in the tree at eye level, you want to photograph as many times as you can, because I guarantee you, you're going to get different expressions in his face, different views of the animal, different colors, the sunlight. So hugely important. You're going to triple the amount of keeper photos you get from a trip if you put this setting on. In addition, another, I could just go on and on with these. Another reason I love burst mode is, you know, I love when animals look back at you. I think that, again, looking and thinking about conservation photography, a way to connect the viewer to the animal is through its eyes. What I'm trying to instill with each and every one of my photographs is a love of nature and a love of that animal. When it connects with me, the photographer, it connects with you, the viewer, and I guarantee you, you like this photo more than if it was looking off into space. Maybe it would be as good of a photo, but I tend to think that when they do have, for that brief moment as they're scanning the landscape, they stop to you and say, oh, not a threat, no big deal, and keep on looking. That brief moment you can get that is all the difference for photography. And of course, capturing those anomalous scenes like three-headed giraffes, that's always a good thing on burst mode too. Okay, dealing with movement. So I just talked about movement a lot. Shooting fast and slow. What is the difference? What is the merit of photographing things really, really fast to stop them in their tracks versus slow? And we're going to talk about big stuff here specifically. So, so here's a quintessential stop motion photo. Freeze the motion of this large African wild dog. You know, I have a high shutter speed. For those of you with point and shoot cameras, this is the icon you're looking for. If you do find this, this prioritizes your entire camera to freeze motion. For those of you with settings or DSLRs or mirrorless cameras or advanced point and shoots, and you do dial in your own settings, you know, a shot like this is probably at 1/1500th of a second. So anyway, freezing motion is good, but I do advocate, per my recommendations here, is, you know, a great thing to try to do is to slow the motion down in terms of your shutter speed to actually add motion to your shot. So if you want to try this, just going to go back here. If you want to try this with a point and shoot camera to juxtapose with that little Running Man photo, you can find this little night settings photo for point and shoots. And what it does is it prioritizes for long shutter speeds. Now, what it does is it usually blurs the whole scene. So, you know, whether you like this photo or not, I'm not sure. I personally like it because I think it is a great story. It tells of the frenetic nature of these wild dogs. You know, they go for, you know, 30-mile runs in some cases, chasing after wildlife to make a meal for the day. And they're absolutely wild when they get in a pack. So I think showcasing that motion is really, really cool. Maybe a more quintessential example here is going to be brown bears in Alaska when they're fishing for salmon. So going back to that frozen motion shot, freezing the motion, it's a great technique for big things, especially animal behaviors. Fast shutter speed, or if you have a point and shoot, getting this little Running Man that prioritizes fast shutter speed. But what happens when the environment is moving around it? Now, this is when things get really cool. Again, the same setting for wild dogs. If you just find this night photo, setting, you can actually slow the shutter down. And as the water is moving, this is a great thing to try for anytime you have moving water. It actually slows the scene down. You capture more in your image, and it provides this beautiful silky waterfall look. And again, if you were with a DSLR, you're probably shooting at 1/20th of a second here because that water is moving so darn fast. Okay, perfecting focus. So we're wrapping up the presentation here. I have a few more slides. This is the time to get your questions in. If you do have questions about anything I talked about here or anything I haven't talked about here, perfecting focus. So this is my personal tip of what I do for my camera settings for big things. We now have many different ways to use autofocus in fancier cameras nowadays. You have all these, multi-point autofocus, center prioritized. I still, to this day, stick with just this one. Always single point centered autofocus every time, all the time, okay? So what that means is that, it might show all these boxes, but it's never gonna use them. What it does is when you hit that shutter button and you hold it halfway down to lock into focus, it is only gonna focus on what appears in that red square at that moment. And the square is never gonna move. One thing I really advocate for is, get yourself away from the camera choosing your focus points. And really for anything out there, landscapes or wildlife, get that center point autofocus each and every time. Now you may be saying, well, Court, don't you always also advocate for focusing on the eyes of animals, especially big animals? If you have to focus somewhere, I always say focus on the eyes. I think that, again, connects the viewer. So in this case, what I would do is I would actually move my camera to put that red little box over the eyes, hold the shutter halfway down, and then recompose the shot, keeping my finger locked down halfway on that shutter button and then depressing fully to take the shot. But nevertheless, that keeps the camera from making too many choices for me. I find that I get the wrong shot more often if I let the camera choose. This all being said, if you have a newer camera, especially mirrorless cameras, like a newer one in the last couple of years, they have some pretty amazing abilities with finding the eye. There's like with Sony and Olympus, there are all these companies out there that have, I think it's called like eye focus or auto eye find. And what it does, it's really good. The technology, the computer actually finds the eyes in the scene, so you don't have to toggle around or move your camera and recompose. I'm not familiar enough with that technology to say that it works 100% of the time, but I do have colleagues that use it and they say it works flawlessly, and it's getting me to rethink whether I'm going to get a mirrorless camera as my next one or not. I probably will, because that technology is game changer. If I don't have to constantly move the camera and it finds the eyes each and every time, wow, what a positive. So folks, we're getting to our penultimate slide here. Just a quick plug for the Natural Photographer. This is the website we have at Natural Habitat Adventures for some great postings on tips and tricks for photography around the world, photo challenges, shot settings, what I bring in my camera bag for certain expeditions. I definitely recommend bookmarking that, checking it out. And then also a link here, if you have heard me mention about my Nature Photography 101 or 102 or primate photography webinars and you haven't yet seen it and you want to get a hold of that, check this out. This link right here will get you right to the past recordings of my past photo webinars. And with that, I will thank you and ask for any questions you have out there.
Great, thanks, Core. That was fun. We do have some questions for you, and I'd just like to remind folks that if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit that in the questions field in your control panel. All right, first question. If you're on a trip and you're photographing people or vehicles at known locations, what kind of permissions or how do you go about doing that?
I apologize later rather than ask permission. No, I'm just kidding. I do that for some things. No, I am careful with that. So yeah, that could be a long answer. I'll try to break it down as simply as possible. First off, if you're doing photography of local folks when you're traveling anywhere, people that you don't know, you should be polite and conscientious and courteous and ask permission. The international symbol for can I take a photograph of you, even if you don't speak the language, is this. If you see my screen, it's hold your camera up and nod. And that's universal language for can I take a photo of you? Half the time people are going to say no. Half the time they're going to say sure. So definitely ask. This is when I'm in markets and villages. I definitely don't want to take people's photo if they're not cool with it. If it's someone that's facing away from me and I'm not photographing their likelihood or their likeliness, whatever the legal term is, yeah, I'll take a photograph because it doesn't identify them as someone that's in my photos. For vehicles and buildings and all that, that's fine. Now, if you're ever going to try stock photography, uploading your photographs to Shutterstock or iStock Photo, you have to think a lot more. If you have any sort of semblance of a person's face, you have to get a written contract permission from them. If you're photographing known landmarks, like public landmarks or privately held buildings, you have to get a photo permission from the owner. So yeah, stock photography is a whole different beast. But if it's your own personal stuff, you don't have to worry about anything except other people's feelings, and that you don't want to just be snapping photos when they may not culturally feel comfortable with that.
Okay, great. Next question. Can you give some advantages or disadvantages of DSLR versus mirrorless cameras?
Oh yeah, that's a very, very good question. So for a long while, DSLRs did have a leg up on mirrorless cameras. The few things that had a leg up is they had faster focus speeds, longer battery life, and a better viewfinder. And yeah, technically a better quality as well. Most of those things have gone away as advantages, and mirrorless cameras now actually have those advantages. They have remarkably fast focusing speeds. They still do have digital viewfinders versus an optical viewfinder, which I think is a little bit of a challenge. However, there is a counter benefit that what you see in your little digital viewfinder in your eye thing is actually going to be exactly representative of what the camera is going to take. Whereas in your optical viewfinder, it's just a periscope. So if you have a different aperture, if it's a certain exposure, light and dark, it's not as accurate. So yes, you still have that. You're looking at a digital screen, so it might be harder to find a little bird in a tree. But there are some other benefits that actually outweigh the negatives. Battery life is still a bit of an issue, I've noticed, but it's not that bad. What does an extra $30 battery cost? And the focusing thing, again, in the past, focusing speed had been superior with DSLRs. Nowadays, mirrorless, maybe the best DSLR with the best lens gives it a run for its money, or maybe it's a tad better. But the focusing, that whole eye focus and like face finding focus that you can get with this higher technology in mirrorless cameras, I think actually makes it a better contender. Really, I think that going forward, mirrorless is probably the way to go if you're buying a new camera. I have a pretty fancy DSLR. I have a 5D Mark IV that I bought, I don't know, three or so years ago. I'm not ready to upgrade yet, so I'm happy with it. But if you are upgrading, I would probably recommend you start looking at the mirrorless cameras, because they're probably the way of the future. Don't go throwing away your good DSLR now, but looking forward, in 5 years, I don't know if Canon, Sony, Nikon, if they're even going to be making DSLRs anymore. I don't know. Maybe just like one model for the highest end sports photographers or something like that.
Okay. Do you have any special tips for shooting from a safari vehicle where you can't control your position and you're often shooting down on animals that are close by?
Yeah, that's why I always like, as a safari guide, I always like rotating people through the vehicles, because it actually does give you a cool vantage point if you're higher up in the back versus if you're down, in the driver's side seat or somewhere in the middle. You can actually be pretty eye level and sometimes below things like giraffes and elephants. So getting different perspectives throughout the trip and throughout the day is always a good idea. As far as you want to make do with whatever you're given. You can't necessarily use each and every one of these techniques for each and every shot you're ever going to get, but all these things will kind of hedge your bet. So that way, when you are on foot, you can use the techniques of photographing up. If you do see, let's say, 2 lions in the savannah, and one is right next to your vehicle where you're photographing at a slight angle down, and one is a little bit away, such that you can actually have an eye level view, or that angle of your camera. Because if you think about it, say you're here and the lion's here, and you're shooting down, that angle is like this, where if it's way far away and over here, you're actually a little bit higher up. So that angle that we have of photographing an animal can actually be lessened if you're photographing something further away. So that's where I like having a little bit more telephoto power. And if I have a choice between 2 objects, or 2 subjects rather, 2 animals, I might take that into consideration. But then, at the end of the day, when you have an animal that close to you, that's when you can fill the frame with its face. That's when you can photograph just its ear. That's when you can photograph just its eye. So, I'm not so much worried about the whole body shot. I'm taking advantage of what has been given to me, what's been gifted to me in that moment, and I'm starting to fill the frame with features and interesting things like that. Or I do the opposite. I pop on a wide angle lens, I photograph high from above, and I get the whole safari vehicle, looking at this beautiful savanna, a lion right here, as casual can be. And I say, look at where we were. What a cool storytelling photo.
Great. And there's someone watching who has a camera without an anti-vibration feature. Should this person buy a new camera body or a new telephoto lens?
Oh, that's a good question. So if you have a Nikon or Canon DSLR, none of those will have vibration technology in the camera itself. This is actually another advantage of mirrorless cameras. Mirrorless cameras, which are like this next generation, they are like a DSLR in that you can change lenses. Their vibration technology is often in the camera itself. It has to do with like the mirror and how it would kind of obstruct and blur vision a little bit. So if you have a DSLR and you don't have vibration reduction, yeah, you get a new lens. The lenses have that technology in it. If you have a point and shoot camera, it may be worth upgrading to a newer point and shoot that has that vibration reduction. The terminology we use with vibration reduction, aka image stabilization, is usually a point system. It's usually called like a 1 or 2 or a 3-point stop. Sometimes just called a stop, like a 3-stop image stabilization. So what that means, I'm going to get a little techie here, but this should be helpful, is if you have a 3-stop image stabilization, the reason we like IS or VR, this whole technology of vibration reduction, is that it minimizes the movement of your hand, the shake of your hand, just by holding it as steady as you can, your hand's still moving a little bit. And so it stabilizes that. You can't stop the wildlife from moving. So if you want to capture wildlife in crisp, stopped, frozen, sharp focus, it doesn't do anything for that, but it does affect hand movement for like landscape shots or sitting animals. So back to this whole stop technology or terminology rather. So say you need to shoot at a 1/300 shutter speed. Okay, one stop slower would be 1/150. Okay, so a 1-stop stabilization system would actually mean you can get the exact same result for a landscape photo at 1/150 as you could at 1/300. A 2-stop means 1/75, and a 3-stop means 1/37.5, right? So what that means is every stop you can actually or you can decrease the shutter speed by half, which means that you can shoot in much lower light conditions, or you can blur that motion by having the shutter open longer. Anyway, I feel like I went a little bit techie there, but that's what that stop terminology is. It's a really, really good thing to have anytime possible. Definitely get vibration reduction or image stabilization. It's going to help the resale value of your camera or lens, and it's going to really, really help with landscape shots and low light shots, which is part of wildlife photography. A lot of wildlife stuff we do is at the early morning or late evening hours, so it's always a good thing to have.
Great. I'm going to combine a couple questions because they both involve a moving object. What's a good shutter speed to blur motion of a moving subject? And what focusing tips do you have for photographing large birds in flight?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, so the first one, as far as shutter speed for moving objects, so this actually, gosh, Kendall, you did perfectly. It pairs exactly with the previous question of like this whole shutter speed thing. So you can't stop the animal, but you do need to consider like your hand movement as well. So like take that photo of the brown bear over the falls. That brown bear was in perfect sharp focus, but the falls were blurred. So I needed to shoot fast enough so that my hand movement didn't play a part, and the bear had to be still enough so that it didn't move within that 1/20th of a second. I was shooting at 1/20th of a second. So that's really good for fast moving things. And it also is fast enough that like, it's not really, really slow. Like 1 second, there's no way I could hold my hand still enough for 1 full second. 1/20th of a second, 1/30th, 1/40th. If I use kind of like the 3 points of contact thing, like, put my elbows down on a railing or on the safari vehicle, I can really brace myself quite well. I'm usually shooting at 1/20th to 1/30th of a second. And the faster the movement of the animal, the more motion there will be. So even though that's not really that slow in traditional sense, it will give you enough movement that can create that really, really cool effect. So birds in flight, that's an instance where you actually do want to fully stop motion. I've seen some cool slow shutter speeds of birds in flight, and that's great too. Do it if you can. But I think traditionally we want to freeze motion. So, what I traditionally do, there are a few ways you can do this. If you have one of the fancier, newer cameras that track follow focus I was talking about with mirrorless cameras, it's usually next to the setting that's like the eye focus. Like you just set your camera on that and hit the button, it finds the moving object and focuses and takes the photo for you. It's absolutely amazing. It's really, really high tech. The old fashioned way is what I'm still doing. And what I'm gonna do is I'm still gonna have that center pointed autofocus. I'm still just gonna do normal autofocus. I'm gonna track that bird across the sky and I'm gonna be on burst mode and I'm gonna kind of just like shoot as many shots as I can as I'm following the bird across the sky. Usually because you're shooting up into the sky, there's plenty of light. You're usually shooting against an overcast or blue sky with a ton of light. So you can shoot at, very high speeds, like, 1/1,000 with a very wide depth of field like f8. And what that does is if you mess up and, say the bird is so big in your frame that you focus on the tail, but the bird is actually the whole frame, an f8 will give you that depth of field where the whole thing's in focus. Or if it's even part of the frame and you don't quite focus on the bird, you focus on like a tree in the background, maybe that wide depth of field covers your tracks a little bit. So I try to go for a wide depth of field if possible, and I try to go for something like 1/1,000 shutter speed or higher. That also means that I can usually shoot at a higher ISO because I'm shooting the sky. It's bright and I'm not too worried about any sort of noise or grain. It's usually just one subject on like a uniform colored background. So I can do noise reduction in Photoshop pretty easily. So yeah, there's usually these other, in older cameras called servo focus, S-E-R-V-O. That's the Canon terminology. I think there's some other ones in Nikon that, it's an older follow focus. And what that'll do, and I use this sometimes, is as you're holding that shutter down halfway, anything that's in that center focus square will automatically continuously readjust focus. And that's pretty helpful because if you're tracking that bird and you get off of it for a second, and that's when you hit focus and you lock it in on a single focus and then go back to the bird, it won't be focused. Whereas if you're kind of all over the place and like you're kind of off the bird and then on the bird with that servo focus, it continually readjusts focus for you. It's a hard thing to do. The best thing you can do for yourself is just practice, 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 read up more on it and experiment with different settings. But those are kind of the basics there.
Great. And do you have any tips for when you're on safari and you're doing a night drive?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it depends on what kind of night drive. So usually when you're on a proper African safari, you're gonna be out more at like dusk and it's definitely getting dark, but you're not really out for hours and hours. And usually the rangers are using more of like a red light or a very subdued yellow light to not, impede any sort of night blindness in part of these nocturnal animals. It's just a sensitive thing. That's pretty hard to do, I would say. If you have a red light shining on an animal, it's hard not to get the red in your scene. If it's at dusk and there's a proper flashlight on it, it's still pretty hard to get. But what you do is instead of so you actually go into your exposure metering menu, and I do spot metering. Okay, so spot metering is a pretty universal term for all camera manufacturers, and what that does is it prioritizes the exposure, meaning like the choice the camera makes of light and dark for just that center focus and that center spot. I usually zoom a little bit farther away, so even if I am close, I'm not trying to fill the frame, and I'm just getting the middle of it focused and just the middle of it exposed right. It's a very, very tricky thing to do if you're on safari. Honestly, it's one of those times that I kind of say, if you take a couple shots and you're not liking the result, this is one of those times you can just put the camera down and enjoy it. Enjoy the cicadas, enjoy the crickets chirping, enjoy the nighttime birds maybe making some sounds. Otherwise, if you do want to try it, spot metering, and then very, very general settings for your shutter speed and aperture, shallow depth of field, because you're limited by light. You're desperate to try to get light in there, but you don't want to blow it with an ISO of 8,000 and then everything's grainy. This would be, as much as I would love to give another 30-minute discussion on that, it's one of those things you almost need to be with someone in the field to coach you on it, given the exact situation and the exact lighting. Because the difference between 8 p.m. and 8:30, the lighting could change the settings entirely.
Mm-hmm. And one more question about safari tips. Is a sandbag a good tool to use to stabilize your camera, or are there any other toys you can use as a substitute for a tripod?
Yes, I am all about minimalist toys and techniques. Usually the lightest, cheapest option that I like. You know what I do when I'm on safari is, generally in safari mornings are a little bit cool, and I'll have like a sweatshirt or a sweater. Is I'll just use that. I'll either take the sleeves and I'll wrap the sleeves around the tip of my lens and tie a knot. And then when I'm balancing the tip of my lens, let's just say this is the camera on the railing, that sweater, that fleece is there, and that's enough to buffer it. Sandbags are great. Bean bags, usually what you need to do is you need to check with your safari operator to make sure they provide one for you. I know at NatHab we provide those on all of our photo trips. Not everyone does. It's a pain to carry those things with you because you're literally using it for the weight and the density. So you would literally need to fly with like 5-10 pounds of sand or beans or rice to fill in a bag. It's not the easiest. In addition, when you move from right to left, you got to pick up this 10-pound bean bag and drape it over the side without making a noise, without making a clunk as the leopard approaches you. So I actually like just tying a sweatshirt or a piece of cloth or a bandana around the tip of my lens, and that's just enough to make it gentle enough that I'm not banging my lens. If there is any bit of vibration from the safari vehicle still being on, as the driver aims to get the engine turned off, it just dampens it enough to make it worthwhile. So I like that a lot. If you're comparing that method with a tripod, the other option, if the camera and lens combo is just too heavy for you, the other option is to get a monopod and just use that to brace on the seat. Either put on the seat next to you or the seat in front of you, and that helps. A tripod is just, it's so cumbersome. It's so clunky in safari. I think it does more harm than good for your photos. Because if you've got a lion over here and then you turn around and you see a pack of wild dogs over here, the last thing you want to do is retract the legs and then undo the ball head and swivel it, and then all of a sudden the wild dogs are gone. So I'm trying to be as lightweight, as versatile, and the great thing is that a lot of these options are inexpensive, so you don't have to invest in a whole new stabilization system like some of these options out there of hundreds of dollars. Just a basic bandana or a sweatshirt is pretty good.
Okay, great. This was fantastic, Court. It's almost the top of the hour, so I'd like to hand it back over to you for some closing comments.
Great. Well, fun stuff today, guys. Great questions, by the way. I love covering all the gamut of possibilities out there. So I hope those were helpful to you. I look forward to seeing you next week. One that I've been kind of dreaming up for a while now, and I'm really looking forward to putting it together and presenting on conservation photography. What is conservation photography? How are you and how can you be a conservation photographer? How can you use your photos for helping to save our wild world? And I'm going to tell you all of my beliefs and how we're doing it and how to do it and next week. But hopefully today, this is a good primer for that conversation, talking about the big things, the charismatic things. We hope to see you out in the field as soon as possible to photograph a lot of these awesome animals alongside.
Thank you so much, Court. And my thanks to everyone who joined us today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.